If your green bean plants always seem to give up in July, then there is a good chance you are making the same mistake. The sad part is that most people never realize they are causing the problem themselves. You water more because the weather gets hotter. You even add more fertilizer because you think the plants are hungry. Then you walk out one morning, and instead of fresh beans, you find a few tired flowers and empty vines that seem to have lost the will to grow. It feels like the season is over long before it should be, and many gardeners simply accept it because they believe green beans only produce for a short time. I used to believe that too until an older gardener showed me one simple habit that takes less than 5 minutes and completely changed the way my plants behaved through the hottest part of summer. Since then, I have watched the same thing happen over and over again. My plants keep flowering while other gardens slow down and stop. The surprising part is that it has very little to do with expensive products or special varieties. It comes down to understanding what the plant is trying to tell you before it gives up. Most people wait until they notice fewer beans, and by then the plant has already started changing its priorities. That is why the fix feels like it never works for them. You have to notice the small signs first, and they are easier to see than most people think. Today, I want to walk you through exactly what I do every single summer, because this old method has saved me money, kept fresh beans on the table for weeks longer, and made gardening feel much less frustrating. I am not asking you to buy anything or rebuild your garden. I only want you to look at your bean plants a little differently because once you understand what is really happening in July, you may never lose another harvest the same way again. And before I show you the simple step that changed everything, there is one mistake almost everyone makes without even noticing it. The biggest mistake happens right after the first heavy harvest, because that is when most gardeners think their job is simply to keep watering and wait for more beans to appear. I used to do exactly that, and every July I watched the same disappointing story unfold. The vines looked healthy from a distance, but when I walked closer, I noticed more leaves than flowers and fewer fresh pods every single week. I thought the summer heat was the enemy and that nothing could be done about it. Then an old friend who had been growing vegetables longer than I had been alive asked me one simple question. He looked at my plants and asked, "When was the last time I picked every mature bean?" I told him I harvested every few days whenever I had enough for dinner. He smiled and said that was exactly why my plants were slowing down. Most people do not realize that a green bean plant has one main goal, and it is not to keep feeding us forever. Its goal is to make seeds. Every large pod that stays on the vine tells the plant its work is almost finished. Once enough pods begin to mature, the plant slowly starts reducing new flowers because it believes the next generation is already growing. That is why production suddenly falls even when the leaves still look green. The good news is that you can change the plant's mind without spending a single dollar. This was the forgotten habit that older gardeners treated as completely normal, but many people stopped doing because life became busy and gardens became something we checked only on weekends. I began walking through my bean rows every morning with a small basket in my hand. I picked every bean that was ready, even if there were only 3 or 4. I never left an oversized pod hanging because I knew it was quietly telling the plant to slow down. Within a short time, I noticed fresh flowers appearing again, where I thought the season was already ending. It felt almost unbelievable because nothing else had changed. I had not added fertilizer, and I had not watered more than usual. I simply removed the signal that told the plant its work was complete. But that was only the first part of the method, because there was another small habit that took less than 5 minutes and made an even bigger difference once the hottest days of July arrived. The second habit surprised me even more because it was so simple that I almost ignored it the first time I heard about it. The old gardener told me that July is not the month when green beans stop producing, because they are old. They stop because they become tired. During long hot days, the plant spends so much energy keeping its leaves alive that it begins saving strength instead of making new flowers. Most people see dry soil and immediately reach for the hose. They give the plants a quick spray every evening and feel they have solved the problem. I did the same thing for years and never understood why my harvest kept getting smaller. Then I learned that shallow watering teaches the roots to stay close to the surface where the soil becomes hot and dry almost every afternoon. Those roots never developed the strength to keep the plant growing through the toughest part of summer. Everything changed when I stopped watering a little every day and started watering deeply, only when the soil truly needed it. I pushed my finger into the ground a couple of inches before making any decision. If the soil still felt cool and slightly damp, I walked away and left the plants alone. If it was dry, then I watered slowly until the moisture reached deep below the roots instead of sitting only on the surface. After that, I spread a simple layer of dry grass clippings around the base of the plants. It cost nothing because I already had the grass from mowing the yard, and it kept the soil cooler for much longer. I noticed that even after several hot afternoons, the ground under that mulch stayed moist, while the uncovered rows dried out much faster. Very few people take those extra 5 minutes, but that small effort changes everything during July. The plants spend less energy fighting heat and more energy producing fresh flowers. I also stopped watering late in the evening, because wet leaves overnight often stayed damp until morning, and that invited problems I did not need. Instead, I watered early in the day so the leaves dried naturally while the roots enjoyed steady moisture below the surface. Within a couple of weeks, I could clearly see the difference. New blossoms kept appearing where I expected empty vines, and the harvest continued when many nearby gardens had already slowed down. But there was still one more forgotten trick that an older generation almost never skipped, and it made the biggest difference of all when production started to fade. The old method that finally convinced me I could keep harvesting long after everyone else had stopped was something I had never seen mentioned on a bag of fertilizer or in a gardening catalog. It happened one afternoon while I was helping an older neighbor clean up his garden. I noticed he carried a small pair of scissors every time he walked between the bean rows. He was not harvesting because there were only a few beans in his basket. Instead, he was quietly cutting away yellow leaves, damaged leaves, and the occasional vine that had completely finished producing. I asked him why he bothered because the plant still looked mostly healthy. He smiled and told me that every leaf the plant could no longer use was still asking for water and energy. If the plant kept feeding tired leaves, it had less strength left to grow fresh flowers and young pods. That simple idea stayed with me. The next morning, I walked through my own garden and looked more carefully than I ever had before. I removed only the leaves that were clearly yellow, dry, or badly damaged. I never stripped the plant because healthy leaves are still the engine that keeps everything growing. I only took away what the plant no longer needed. The whole job took less than 5 minutes for an entire row. A week later, I noticed something that surprised me. The vines looked more open and fresh. Air moved through them more easily after summer rain, and I could actually see new flowers forming instead of hiding behind old, fading leaves. Harvesting also became easier because I no longer missed mature beans tucked away inside thick foliage. Most people either never prune green beans at all or they remove far too much at one time. Both mistakes slow the plant down. The goal is not to make the vines look perfect. The goal is simply to help the plant spend its energy where it matters most. Every few days, I repeated the same slow walk through the garden, with my basket in one hand and my scissors in the other. I harvested every ready bean. I removed only what was truly finished. Then I left the healthy vines alone to keep doing their work. That quiet routine became one of the most relaxing parts of my morning, and before long I realized my green beans were producing long after I expected them to quit. But there was one final habit that tied all of these simple steps together, and without it, even the healthiest plants eventually began to lose their momentum. The last habit that really changed the way I grew green beans had nothing to do with adding more products to the soil. In fact, it was about knowing when to stop trying to force the plants to grow. Many gardeners see fewer beans in July and immediately reach for another fertilizer because they think the plants are running out of food. I understand that feeling because I did exactly the same thing. Sometimes the leaves became darker green, but the flowers never returned the way I hoped. An older gardener explained to me that once healthy bean plants have enough nutrition, they often need balance more than they need more feeding. Too much fertilizer, especially one high in nitrogen, tells the plant to keep making leaves instead of putting its energy into flowers and pods. That was a lesson I never forgot. Instead of feeding on a schedule, I began watching the plants themselves. If the leaves were healthy green and growing well, I left them alone. I focused on harvesting, often keeping the roots evenly moist and removing only the leaves that had finished their job. Then I started paying attention to something else that almost nobody talks about. Every few days, I gently lifted the vines just enough to see underneath them. If I found weeds beginning to grow close to the stems, I pulled them while they were still small. Tiny weeds may not seem important, but they quietly steal moisture and nutrients exactly when the summer heat is already making life harder for the beans. The whole job usually took no more than 5 minutes, yet it made the garden feel cleaner and healthier. I also noticed that better air movement around the base of the plants meant the leaves dried faster after rain, which helped avoid many common problems later in the season. Little by little, these simple habits worked together. None of them seemed impressive on their own, but together they kept the plants active far longer than I had ever managed before. That is something many people miss because they search for one miracle trick instead of several small habits that support each other. The truth is that green beans respond to steady care much better than occasional big efforts. I found myself harvesting fresh pods week after week, while friends were already pulling out their vines and preparing those beds for something else. They often asked what special fertilizer I was using, and I always smiled because the answer disappointed them. There was no expensive secret at all. There was only a quiet routine that anyone could follow. And the best part was still waiting because once I understood one final lesson, I stopped worrying every time July arrived and started looking forward to it instead. There came a point when I stopped measuring success by how many beans I picked on one afternoon and started paying attention to how long the plant stayed productive. That small change in thinking made me a much better gardener because I stopped chasing quick results and focused on giving the plants a reason to keep growing. Every July, I followed the same simple routine without rushing. Early in the morning, I walked through the rows while the air was still cool. I harvested every bean that was ready, even if my basket was almost empty. I checked the soil before watering instead of watering from habit. I looked for a few yellow leaves that had finished their work and removed them carefully. If I saw tiny weeds starting to appear, I pulled them before they became a problem. The entire walk usually lasted less than 10 minutes, yet those few minutes saved me hours of disappointment later in the season. What surprised me most was how quickly the plants responded once they stopped wasting energy. New flowers appeared where I thought production had already ended. Fresh pods seemed to replace the ones I had picked only a few days before. Instead of watching the garden slow down, I found myself carrying another basket back to the house every week. My neighbors often assumed I had planted a different variety or used some expensive product they had never heard about. When I explained my routine, they usually laughed because it sounded too simple to make such a difference. But gardening has taught me that simple habits repeated at the right time are often more powerful than complicated solutions. I have seen seasons with heavy rain and seasons with weeks of heat, and my routine never changed very much. That consistency gave the plants what they needed instead of making them adjust to something new every few days. The best part was not only the extra harvest, it was the peace of mind that came with knowing I understood what my plants were telling me. I no longer felt frustrated when July arrived because I knew exactly what signs to watch for and exactly how to respond before small problems became big ones. There is a quiet confidence that comes from walking into your garden and knowing that most of what you need is already there. You do not need expensive bottles, colorful labels, or complicated schedules. You need a few careful minutes, a little patience, and the willingness to notice the small changes that many people walk right past. And there is one final thought that completely changed the way I look at every growing season, and it is the reason I never rush to pull out my green bean plants the moment production begins to slow down. The biggest lesson I have learned after all these years is that a garden rewards attention much more than effort. I used to believe I needed to work harder every summer, but now I know I simply needed to pay closer attention to the small signals my plants were giving me. Green beans do not suddenly stop producing in July for no reason. Long before the harvest slows, they begin showing little signs that something needs to change. If you notice those signs early and respond with a few simple habits, the plants often keep rewarding you long after you expected the season to be over. That is why I no longer rush to pull my vines out of the garden the moment production slows. Instead, I harvest every mature bean before it becomes too old. I water deeply only when the soil truly needs it. I keep a light layer of mulch around the roots to protect the soil from the hottest days. I remove only the leaves that have finished their job, and I keep weeds from stealing the moisture that belongs to my plants. None of these steps cost much money, and most of them cost nothing at all. They only ask for a few quiet minutes every few days. Over time, those minutes become baskets of fresh beans that many people never expect to harvest so late into summer. That is one of the reasons I still enjoy gardening after all these years, because every season reminds me that simple habits often bring the biggest rewards. You do not have to chase every new product or every new gardening trend. Sometimes the best ideas are the ones that have been quietly passed from one gardener to another for generations. I hope the next time you walk into your garden during the heat of July, you will remember that your green beans are not giving up. They are simply waiting for the right kind of care. Give them those few extra minutes and let them show you what they can really do. I think you will be surprised by how many more fresh beans end up on your table before the season is finally over. And once you see the difference for yourself, you may start looking at every other vegetable in your garden with the same simple question: what small habit have I been overlooking all these years that could completely change the harvest next season?